Hello and welcome to French Philosophers React, a philosophical take on the news headlines for today, August 29th, 2024. This is an AI-generated podcast and can make mistakes. Use it for generating possible ideas, but don't rely on it as an authoritative guide to the news or to the details of French philosophy. In the news today, the US and UN are calling for talks in Libya's dispute over control of its central bank. The conflict has led to arbitrary arrests, intimidation of employees, and threats from militia. Sadiq al-Kabir, the sacked governor, has refused to hand over secret codes to the new leadership, while the Eastern administration has suspended oil production and exports until Kabir is reappointed. The crisis has sparked concerns about Libya's economic stability and has led to a deepening divide within the country's elite. So, what might French philosophers have to say about this news item? The crisis unfolding in Libya's central bank is a stark reminder that even the most seemingly innocuous institutions can become battlegrounds for competing interests and ideologies. But what if we were to look beyond the surface-level power struggles and instead examine the underlying narrative structures that shape our understanding of this conflict? In doing so, I argue that the Libyan central bank dispute reveals a deeper struggle between two incommensurable conceptions of time, one rooted in the linear, progressive logic of modernity, and the other embedded in the cyclical, repetitive rhythms of traditional societies. This dichotomy is expertly theorized by Paul Ricoeur in his magnum opus, Time and Narrative, which offers a framework for understanding the temporal dynamics at play in this conflict. Ricoeur's central insight is that our experience of time is always already narratively mediated, meaning that we make sense of our lives through the stories we tell about ourselves and our place within the world. In the context of the Libyan central bank dispute, we can see how competing narratives are being mobilized to justify different claims to authority and legitimacy. On one hand, the Western-backed government is pushing for a more modernized, technocratic approach to banking, which relies on a linear understanding of time as a series of discrete, measurable moments. This narrative emphasizes progress, efficiency, and transparency, and is underpinned by a faith in the ability of human reason to shape the world according to its designs. On the other hand, the Eastern administration's refusal to recognize the new governor and their insistence on reappointing Sadiq al-Kabir can be seen as an attempt to reimpose a more traditional, cyclical understanding of time. This narrative emphasizes continuity, tradition, and loyalty, and is rooted in a deep-seated skepticism towards the West's attempts to impose its own temporal logic on Libyan society. By suspending oil production and exports, the Eastern administration is effectively trying to disrupt the linear flow of time, creating a moment of stasis that allows for a reevaluation of the country's priorities and values. Ricoeur would likely argue that these two narratives are not simply competing ideologies, but rather represent two fundamentally different ways of being in the world. The modernist narrative relies on an eschatological conception of time, where events are seen as leading towards a definitive endpoint or goal. In contrast, the traditionalist narrative is characterized by a more cyclical understanding of time, where events are seen as part of a larger pattern of repetition and return. As we examine the Libyan central bank dispute through this lens, it becomes clear that what is at stake is not simply control over a key institution, but rather two competing visions of the future. The West's emphasis on modernization and technocracy represents a desire to shape Libya's destiny according to its own eschatological narrative, whereas the Eastern administration's insistence on tradition and continuity embodies a resistance to this imposed temporal logic. Ricoeur's concept of narrative identity is also particularly relevant here. He argues that our sense of self is always already narratively constructed, meaning that we understand ourselves through the stories we tell about our past experiences and future aspirations. In the context of the Libyan central bank dispute, it becomes clear that competing narratives are being mobilized to construct different identities for the country. The Western-backed government's narrative emphasizes Libya's potential as a modern, progressive nation, whereas the Eastern administration's narrative highlights its rich cultural heritage and tradition. Ultimately, the Libyan central bank dispute represents a struggle between two incommensurable conceptions of time, each with its own narrative logic and implications for the country's future. As Ricoeur would likely argue, what is needed is not simply a resolution to the conflict through diplomacy or force, but rather a deeper understanding of the competing temporal narratives at play. Only by acknowledging and respecting these different conceptions of time can we begin to build a more just and equitable society that honors the complex, multifaceted nature of human experience. Thank you for listening to today's episode of French Philosophers React. Be sure to come back tomorrow for more reflective takes on the day's news.